On December 3rd of 2008, an anonymous guest was invited onto the cult classic late-night radio show Coast to Coast AM to discuss his unbelievable story about something that he'd witnessed in Afghanistan. The man in question claimed to be an active-duty C-130 pilot, and he joined on with an investigator named Steve Quayle, who made documentaries for a company called Gen 6 Productions. According to Quayle, the pilot's mother had come across his work and then reached out to him on behalf of her son and had to convince her son to talk to him. Quayle apparently checked the man's paperwork and confirmed that he was in fact an active-duty Air Force pilot. This anonymous pilot told the following story. In 2005, him and a crew of 6 were deployed to a base in Afghanistan called Bagram. Bagram was an old Russian air base they were using, built way high up into a bowl in the mountains. The area to the side of it was called the Valley of Death because the Mujahideen used to fire rockets into the helicopters passing through there. So if you looked down while you were flying over, you could still see all of the wreckage from that. It sounded like a totally normal mission for them at first, and they weren't alerted to anything unusual. They landed in the middle of the day, and it was very hot, and they were told to go down to the very end of the tarmac. When they opened up the rear cargo ramp and walked outside, some men that he later referred to as the babysitters, along with a few other army guys, were there. The babysitters immediately told them that there would be no cameras allowed because they were transporting something that was highly classified. The crew had to wait around for a while for the load to get there, and the babysitters didn't really tell them anything other than that, so their curiosity about what it could be just kept growing and growing. When it finally got there, the first thing that this pilot noticed was the stench. He said it had an absolutely foul odor that was beyond just the normal smell of a decaying animal. What they had there was a normal 463L pallet loaded with what they were told was a giant. Most of the body was covered up, so he didn't get a great look at it, but he could tell right off the bat that this thing was massive. The size of the pallet was 9 by 7 feet, and he said it was curled up on its side in the fetal position, and that it filled the entire pallet. From this, he estimated it was about 10 to 12 feet tall. But it wasn't just tall, it was large too, and the body was proportional to the height. The crew then started going up to it and putting their feet next to its feet to compare the size, and this guy's feet were extremely large. He estimated that they were about 25 to 30 inches. The feet had some kind of rudimentary canvas wrapped around them as makeshift shoes, and the giant's hands were also visible, and to the pilot's bewilderment, they appeared to have 6 fingers on each. The skin tone was a pasty white, as if Caucasian. Some of the guys also went up to hit this thing with their fists, and apparently the body was very dense, almost as hard as a rock. When the loadmaster weighed the pallet, the total was around 1,500 pounds, so factoring in the weight of the pallet, they determined that the body was around 1,100 pounds. The pilot asked where they had found this freak of nature, and some of the army guys relayed that he had been living up in the mountains next to a village where the villagers revered him as a god. They inferred that the villagers had been making sacrifices to him because they found human bones nearby. According to the story, a team had come across him while they were out patrolling the mountains looking for Taliban. When the men hadn't come back for a while, another team was sent in to look for them. The first thing that the second team noticed was the rib cages and skulls of their fellow soldiers strewn around the ground. They then encountered the giant, who was reportedly chowing down on one of their men. And by that time, this team was prepared, and they opened fire. The giant started to run away while throwing rocks back at them, and he was apparently very fast and agile for a guy that size. But they were eventually able to kill it and then airlifted it back down to the base. Once the body was loaded onto the C-130, the pilot was ordered to fly it back to Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, and from there it was loaded onto a C-17 and taken away. That was the last the pilot ever saw of it. But he did ask around later, inquiring about where it might have gone, and the rumor he had heard through the grapevine was Wright-Patterson Air Base in Ohio. And if you're as deep into conspiracies as I am, then you'll know about Wright-Pat. The source for the story apparently chose to remain anonymous out of fear for what the military might do to him for speaking out. Now, obviously, because the source chose to be anonymous, there's no way of knowing if this story is actually true or not. So technically, there's absolutely no reason why we should believe anything that this guy said. But he isn't the first person to tell stories about giants. And there may even actually be archaeological evidence from North America that points to the existence of these types of beings. 1911, in Lovelock, Nevada, two miners named David Pugh and James Hart were searching a cave for bat guano, or dried poop, which was commonly used for fertilizer, when they made a shocking discovery. They uncovered mounds of human skeletons, some of which were said to be abnormally tall. Newspapers at the time reported that several of these skeletons were between 7 and 8 feet in height, which would have been very significant compared to the natives living in that area at the time. Later excavations in 1912 and 1924 found the remains of about 45 human skeletons in the cave and over 100,000 artifacts, some of which were very perplexing. For example, they found a 15-inch long sandal, which would have been around size 29 US. They also found enormous textiles for clothes that looked like they would have been fit for a giant. And if all this wasn't strange enough, they apparently found red hair alongside these skeletons. So if all of this is true about the height and the hair color, it would suggest that these were a very different type of people than what was common to that area at the time. The skeletons recovered in the excavations were sent to the Museum of Anthropology at UC Berkeley. Over the past few decades, many of them have been repatriated back to the native tribes of that area and are no longer available for public display or research. There is also no public documentation of giant skeletons that exist in the museum's collection today, and unfortunately, the access to these remains is extremely limited, so it's hard to say what's true. However, several eyewitness accounts have actually reported seeing abnormally large skulls in the Humboldt Museum in Winnemucca, Nevada, that are said to have come from the Lovelock Cave excavation. A man named M.K. Davis even photographed 4 of these skulls as recently as 2006. I'll show the photo on screen right now. Personally, I don't know anything about anatomy, so I can't really say if these skulls look abnormally large or not, but you can see it for yourself here. Davis says the museum used to keep these skulls in the basement for private viewing, but for some reason they're no longer there. Another fascinating thing about this is that the Paiute Indians, who are indigenous to that area, actually have legends that seem to align with the mystery archaeological findings. The Paiute had legends of a tribe of people eaters called the Sitika, who used to cannibalize their tribe and were ultimately vanquished by them after a long and bloody war. This story had been passed down orally for hundreds of years, but the earliest recorded telling of it was published in 1883 by a woman named Sarah Winnemucca, who wrote a book called Life Among the Paiute about her life and the traditions of her tribe. At the end of chapter 4, she wrote about a small tribe of barbarians who used to live on the Humboldt River hundreds of years prior. According to the story, there were 2,600 of them. They spoke the same language as them, and they had reddish hair. They used to dig holes in the Paiutes' trails at night and then attack and eat them. They would even eat their own dead and dig up the Paiutes' dead to eat as well. Naturally, the Paiutes got tired of these guys trying to eat them all the time, so they waged war. It lasted 3 years, and they killed the Sitika in great numbers. Finally, the last of the Sitika went into a cave near the mountains, and the Paiutes filled the mouth of the cave with wood and brush and set it on fire, burning them alive. Her recounting of the story doesn't mention that this tribe was abnormally large, but it did say that they had reddish hair. And she even had a dress with some of the red hair sewn into it that she would wear when she lectured. It's not totally clear who first said that the Sitika were abnormally large, but it might have just been added to the story in the 20th century after the archaeological findings. So there's a lot of different versions of this story told, and it's a little hard to know what the truth is. But some archaeologists think that this story about the Sitika may actually be the historical truth behind what happened to those 45 skeletons in Lovelock Cave. As it turns out, these kinds of reports about giant skeletons being discovered were actually very common in the early days of the Wild West. There are well over 100 reported cases of people digging up skeletons between 7 and 12 feet tall all over across the US for the past 200 years. It's really hard to say how much of this was true and how much was just people making stuff up to sell newspapers, but it is fascinating that this was such a widely reported phenomenon. One of the biggest hotbeds for these kinds of discoveries was Adams County, Ohio. And one such example of this was reported in the Evening Bulletin on March 21st, 1882, which said, "A few days ago, some boys digging in an earth mound a short distance from Manchester, Ohio, brought to light human skeletons in a good state of preservation that measured over 9 feet in length. The head was of enormous size, the jawbone fitting loosely over the head of a large man." Another interesting thing about Adams County, Ohio, is that it's home to an incredible, mysterious archaeological site called the Great Serpent's Mound. It's a serpent-shaped mound that stretches 13,000 miles across the ground, and the head of the serpent aligns perfectly with the setting sun on the summer solstice. This site was very interesting because there's a lot of debate about how old it is. Most archaeologists believe that it's around 1,000 years old, while another group attribute it to the Adena culture, which would put it at 2,300 years old. What's frustrating about many of these discoveries is that there's no documentation about what happened to the skeletons after they were found. But in a few dozen of these cases, the Smithsonian Institution was listed as the recipient of the skeletons, and they've never been seen again. This fact has fueled a lot of theories online about a potential cover-up. And the US definitely isn't the only country where people apparently find these giant skeletons. 2 other hotbeds for this type of activity that I don't really have time to get into in this video, but I would recommend you check out, are around Machu Picchu in Peru and the island of Sardinia in Italy. At the time that these skeletons were being discovered in the Americas, a lot of people equated them to the Nephilim in the Bible. The Nephilim appeared in only 2 passages of the Bible, and those were some of the most mysterious ones. In Genesis 6:1-5, it said that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. And in Numbers 13:32-33, the Israelites reported seeing the Nephilim when exploring the land that God had promised to them, describing them as giants, saying that we seemed like grasshoppers in their eyes, and we looked the same to them. The Old Testament really doesn't expand on who the Nephilim are, other than these 2 mysterious passages, but a lesser-known book written between the 3rd and 1st centuries BCE, called the Book of Enoch, goes really deep into explaining the story of the Nephilim. Big sections of Enoch were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the Book of the Watchers within Enoch 1, it explains that the Nephilim were the sons of fallen angels, also known as the B'nai Elohim. The B'nai Elohim came down to earth to have sex with human women, and the women gave birth to the Nephilim. In 1 Enoch 7, it said that the women bore great giants, whose height was 300 cubits. This would have been about 450 feet tall, so dear God, I feel bad for the women giving birth to them. As the story goes, the Nephilim were devious angels that wreaked havoc on the earth. They taught humans evil things like how to make weapons for war, do sorcery, cast spells, and read the meaning of the stars. They were also cannibals. Enoch 7:3-5 says, "The giants began to kill men and devour them, and then kill all the beasts and drank their blood." The humans eventually called out to God for help, and the story culminates with God sending down 4 of his archangels to destroy the Nephilim and banish them to hell. By the 4th century, the Book of Enoch had basically been rejected by the church, but it's still popular in Ethiopia today and is actually one of the main holy texts of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Ethiopian Orthodoxy is one of the oldest surviving Christian traditions, and they recognize a lot more of the ancient books that have been left out of Christianity today. The Native Americans and the Hebrews are far from the only cultures who had myths about giants. Legends of giants pop up all around the world in pretty much every major culture. Other notable stories about giants come from the Greeks, as portrayed in the Odyssey, Scandinavian giants known as Jontar, Canaanite giants were called the Anakim, and there's even giant beings in the Far East like Nagas and Rakshasas in Buddhism and Hindu cosmology. Personally, I really want there to be giants. I think that that would be so cool, but the truth is that there really isn't a smoking gun to prove any of this. I would really like to know what happened to those 9-foot skeletons, though, that the Smithsonian supposedly received. But other than that, I can't confidently say that giants have ever existed. Still, it is cool to think about, and it's interesting that there's so many stories like this from all around the world in different unrelated cultures. So, I don't know, are there giants? Let me know what you guys think in the comments. If you like this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel. I'll be putting out more videos like this about interesting topics every month. And as always, I'll include all of my references below. Peace.